So today's class, class 3, is on soil health, bed preparation, and irrigation, part 1 of 3. So our agenda for today, we're welcoming, we're talking about soil health, we're talking about bed prep, irrigation. Any lingering questions from the seeding class and seed starting, anything like that that you're just sort of pondering, being like, what about this, what about that? Nope, everybody's ready to start a greenhouse business? All right. Yeah?
Question for you. So we were picking up some seed the other day. Yeah. They were recommending not to plant until May 15th.
Yeah, in the ground for like a lot of the later crops like tomatoes, peppers, things like that, yeah. Yeah, generally like mid-May. I mean, down this, this is probably the farthest south I've grown personally. You might be able to get away with like May 6th. And then if it looks like there's going to be a cold snap, either have some row cover, or if you don't have row cover, a sheet or something like that out over the stuff you put in the field. But yeah, definitely like May is really the time for your tomatoes, your peppers, your cucurbits, things like that, just because they won't tolerate a freeze at all. Sweet potatoes actually even like it maybe a little bit later in May if you have sweet potato slips that you're starting. Whoops. But yeah, that's generally like, I guess the traditional thing I hear up generally in the Midwest is Mother's Day weekend is the time to plant a lot of stuff. Obviously your cold crops, if I had them ready, I'd be planting kale and stuff last week, maybe, or this week potentially. I mean, especially even if it wasn't as hot as it was last week. Actually, given the temperature fluctuations, I might wait for it to steady out a little bit, but for the most part, yeah.
So in those, how many seeds would you put in each of those little dividers?
Yeah, in the cells in a plug tray. Typically, I plant 1 to 3 in a single cell. It depends on typically, if I can fill a whole tray with a variety or whatever, I just do 1 cell per. And especially if I'm going to pot up or put it into the field pretty directly, then I might do 2 if I need to double up or if I need some extra. Like, if I want to plant 110 seedlings, but my tray only has 98 cells, I'll just double up a few rows. And then when it comes to potting them up or putting them out, you just gently split apart the cell and then transplant it. The plants aren't really harmed by that so long as you're gentle. Don't just like take it and rip it, but be careful. Try to get as much roots with each plant as possible. Sometimes if I have a really old seed, I'll do 3 or 4 sometimes if I think it's not going to have very good germination. If you're not sure about germination, you can do a germination test and put the seeds in put them in some paper towel that's moist, and then put that in a Ziploc bag for a few days, and then open it and put it in a windowsill and open it up and see how many have started to germinate. And that can tell you roughly what percentage you're going to get. And then you can adjust accordingly. So, if you're doing tomatoes and you do that little germ test, you do 10 seeds and only 5 of them grow, that tells you you're probably going to need double the seed that you would expect to actually get the number that you want. So in that case, I might do 2 or 3 to a cell just to be safe.
And would you expect for them to start to come up after a week?
It depends on the temperature you're keeping them at and what the temperature that the seeds, that type of plant likes. So if you look at that temperature chart, if you've been keeping your tomatoes pretty cold and if they're not up after a week, that's not unusual. It might take them a couple weeks to really start going. But if they're nice and toasty, you have a bottom warmer, or they're in a sunny space like a greenhouse or something, then you might start being a little worried, being like, okay, what's going on here? Sometimes things are just slow. Sometimes that happens. Yeah, it should be, moist. You want to make sure it's keeping it moist. You're going to use a mister to water, so it'll stay nice and moist. And you want to make sure that there was good soil to seed contact. So that's what helping keep it moist helps that soil sink down and touch the seed. And that way the seed will, it's called, the seed imbibes the water, it fattens up. The little embryo inside the seed then says, aha, I have enough water to really get going. Because, oh, here's a quick question. Seeds, are they alive?
No, they're dormant.
They are dormant, but they are still alive. That's why they can keep going. So that means that's why seeds only last a certain amount of time, because even though they're dormant, they're still using up energy. It's like a hibernating bear or something. So, they're still alive, they still need water, they still need oxygen and things like that. It just takes them a while to adding the water helps kickstart the process to get them growing quickly. And if they don't have, if they kept in a really, really dry space for a long time, they run out of water, they die. So there's a number of different things that cause seeds to finally die, and if they're dead, they don't germinate.
Is there like a standard expiration period for seeds, or is it specifically per type of seed?
So in general, like onions typically last about a year, anything in the onion family. You can get away with maybe a second year set of seeds and see how it goes. But after that, germination drops off pretty rapidly. Other seeds, typically you can get 2 to 4 or 5 years out of seeds. Again, just the longer you go, the more likely you are to have germination failure. Peppers are pretty notorious for having poor germination after a couple of years. But you never know. I mean, archaeologists found some 1,000-year-old date palm seeds in Jerusalem, planted them, and got some to grow. So, sometimes you luck out. Yes.
So how long would you say before they germinate to put them in the ground?
So that depends on the type of crop and whether or not you want to pot up or anything like that. So one of the handouts you got last week, the planting guide, has some information about basically when you want to start them versus when you expect them to go in the ground. So like tomatoes, typically it says start 6 to 8 weeks before you put them in the ground, so before mid-May. And typically, if you're going to take them from a cell tray and put them into a bigger pot, then you want to start them a little earlier, because that way then you can put them in the pot and give them a chance to get nice and big and healthy. Whereas if you're just going to go straight from the cell tray right out into the field, you might want to do it a little on the later side, so that way they don't get root bound and they don't just overuse the limited fertility in your soil media. But it varies depending on which type of crop. So, like eggplant, for example, needs a little bit longer to grow. Oftentimes they recommend you start those 8 to 11 weeks before the last frost. And some things are very fast. So, like lettuces, your brassicas, those things you can do pretty quickly, maybe a month. And then they germinate. You want them to develop some true leaves, and then out in the field they go. Any other lingering questions? All right, cool. Let's continue on. All right, so soil health. We're going to talk about a number of different things about soil health. So here we have soil health is the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. I would also argue it also supports microorganisms as well. Can anybody tell me, so I'm saying soil, can anybody define soil for me? It's okay to take a stab in the dark.
Medium of growing. It's an ecosystem in itself.
Yeah.
Made up of several different minerals, organic matter, remains.
Yeah, exactly. Anybody else have anything to add to that definition? Yeah, so it is a number thing. It is one of the important things. It is this ecosystem, a combination of living and non-living or formerly living materials that sort of interact also around a matrix of physical mineral composites and composition. So there's the organic composition of soil and everything that lives in the soil, and there's the inorganic composition, which is just all the minerals, sand, particles, and things like that that make up the soil. So see, here we have a little diagram. You can see, so in a perfect world, the perfect soil is about 45% mineral composition, 25% air, 25% water, and 5% organic matter. Though, I mean, 5%, yeah, that's pretty decent. We can go higher, though, we can go higher. So I'm just going to talk briefly about soil texture. If any of you have had any sort of soil science class, you might have heard of a soil triangle, which is basically there's three broad categories of size in soil in terms of particle size. And what your makeup is of these different particles helps determine some of the characteristics of your soil. So the three are sand, silt, and clay. And one way to think about this is, so like sand is kind of like a basketball. It's fairly big. You know, it's I mean, so like obviously like round is kind of a general term, but basically like, so sand, you can think of sand being kind of basketball size. Silt might be more baseball size, softball maybe. And clay would be something maybe like a marble. And so your soil is made up of all these three different components, and that's really a pretty accurate comparison microscopically of the difference in particle size. Like clay is very, very tiny particles, silt is quite a bit bigger, and sand is quite large. And so one of the ways I like to think about this physical composition is, imagine you had a big trash bin and it's full of, say, basketballs. So if you were thinking about a trash bin full of basketballs compared to a trash bin full of marbles, what do you think the differences are between those two things? The amount of water is an important thing. Like the amount of particles, is that what you're going for? Yeah. So obviously you have more little particles in the marble one than the basketball one. Anything else? The amount of air. Yeah, the amount of air. Which one has more air? Yeah, exactly right. Again, because the basketballs are big, they fit together kind of clumsily, so there's these big gaps of air in them. So that tells you, so sand, similarly, has lots of pockets of air. It's really great for aeration, so it has all that nice air space for your roots to grow in, because your roots also need oxygen, as we talked about before. However, what if I I take my trash bin full of basketballs, and let's say there's some holes in the bottom, and I pour a bunch of water into that basketball trash can. What do you think is going to happen? It's going to go right through, exactly right, yeah. So, and then same thing with sand. So you might be familiar with sandy soils. Water just goes in and out, in and out. It's very hard to keep water in there. So that means if you're growing something in a sandy soil, you need to water more frequently because it doesn't hold on to the water. Now, if you have your bin full of marbles, what happens is you put that water in, and it has to wind its way all through all the different really tight spaces around the marble, so it takes a long time to go through. It'll still go through eventually, but it slows down the infiltration, which allows plants to pick it up better. It also, if there's other things in the soil that can hold on to nutrients and hold on to water, it helps those things hold on to the water. So yeah, and there's a couple other differences, but those are some of the big ones: air and water, and that are really the two big things about physical characteristics. You'll also find that the smaller particles, clay especially, tends to have an electrical charge, which means it can hold on to nutrients better. This is called cation exchange capacity. The exact nature of what that is kind of complex, and I won't get into it too much, but basically, like, the more clay and small particles there are, you can think of it sort of almost like static electricity, like, stuff, because it has to go through and rub it more and touch it more, then it kind of gets stuck. Sort of like if you rub your balloon on your hair and stick it to the wall, sort of thing. So that's a very loose and not really technically accurate description, but that's the idea. That's a metaphorical idea, is it can hold on to nutrients and things better. So in a perfect world, really, we have a mix of all these kinds of particles in order to have air, have water, and have nutrients stick around in the soil, not just wash out. one of the big factors of the reason why, like, there's more air in the sand and water holding in the clay, for example, is also that very small spaces, there's still air in there, there's not a lot, but like there's a lot greater surface area is one of the other reasons why it holds on to things so much better in the clay. Because if you had a whole bunch of marbles the size of a basketball, you've got a whole lot more surface to deal with than if you just had a basketball. Does that make sense? I know sometimes the concept of surface area can be a little iffy to think about. Yeah, does the idea of surface area and how that makes sense, how basically there's more of it, because basically like all that space inside the basketball is then actually exposed and touches things, the water, the nutrients, and everything else in that analogy that I was doing. Qualities of healthy soil. So we have good physical structure and tilth. So that essentially means a nice mix of sand, of clay, of some silt, so that we have the ability to hold water, but also have a good amount of air. You can mimic some sand stuff like that, like in terms of the aeration capacity using organic matter, because pieces of organic matter are big and clunky and take up a lot of space. So they have that sort of similar function. So even if you don't have a very sandy soil, having organic matter helps provide the same sorts of functions, but with better cation exchange capacity. The soil should be firm, but not compacted. So you should still be able to dig into it pretty easily, but it shouldn't just fly away when the wind goes, or squish down and sink into it if you step on it or anything like that. So yeah, proper regulation of air and water. It should have some infiltration, should have some air, but it shouldn't nothing should just run off and nothing should just go straight through, essentially. Adequate nutrient levels and cycling, again, that brings up that cation exchange capacity. Good organic matter content, so a good range is typically 4 to 8% or higher. Some of the people who are really intense about managing their organic matter can get it up into the low teens. A lot of soils around here, even agricultural soils, might be more often in the 3% to 4% range. Urban soils are probably going to be even less. So it takes a little bit of work to get back to a higher organic matter content. The nice thing about organic matter also is that it serves as a source of fertility. As that organic matter, because it's from formerly living organisms, as it breaks down and it's broken down by fungi and bacteria, that releases nutrients for other plants and things to use, and animals as well. So diverse and high microorganism populations. Again, basically you can think of, some of you have how many of you heard of the fact that in terms of a cell number count, the human body is more microorganisms than it is human. There's more microorganism cells in our body and on our body than there are human cells. Microorganisms happen to be, especially bacteria, much more small than our cells, so that's part of the reason. But having a diverse microbiome helps regulate and deal with things. It doesn't allow any one thing to sort of take control of the system, which can also often be what happens when you have a disease or a pest problem. In a diverse ecosystem, something comes along and eats that or destroys that thing because, hey, if there's a lot of it, that means that's a food source. And something that can use that as a food source will be around there to deal with it. We want appropriate pH. So pH refers to the acidity or alkalinity of the soil. Plants need a certain pH in order to grow. Most plants like slightly acidic to neutral. Some plants like very acidic. Very few plants like basic soils. But for the most part in your growing soils, you want a pH somewhere between 5.8 and 7. Usually 6.5 is pretty good. And you want to limit erosion, so you don't want just water rushing over it to take soil away. You don't want it to be wind to blow it away. You want to have enough living material to hold on to the soil and not just let it go somewhere else. Yeah?
Is that 5.8?
To 7. Yeah, so lower is more acidic, higher is more basic. 6 to 6.5 is pretty good. 7 is fine. Just the reason that it matters is because the nutrient uptake of different important nutrients really drops off pretty fast if it gets too low or too high. So if you have a different pH, your plant, you could put all the fertilizer in the world on your plant, and if it's the wrong pH, it might just not be able to take it up. Most of your soils around here are going to be in that range. They might be a little bit basic, especially if you have limestone nearby. But for the most part, I think in my experience, most of the soils that we're going to work with in this type of environment are going to be close to that range, maybe a little bit more neutral or basic, but not that much. Yeah, so when you get so we'll talk a little bit about soil testing in a second, but you can essentially, there are some home pH tests that just do some testing, and I'll get to all your questions in just a second. But you can also send your soil to a soil lab and get it analyzed, and then they'll tell you also not just the pH, but the organic matter content, some other nutrient contents. You can look for lead in the soil, arsenic, and other dangerous things as well. But yeah, there are some, I think, there's some things you can get probably at Lowe's that will just, that can do a pH test that's fairly simple. Those aren't always super accurate, but you can give you a good idea. So I think I saw your hand first, then you, yeah.
I was just curious to how you test the pH levels, and is the testing similar to how you do the soil?
So it's, like I said, I guess I'm not super familiar with the mechanics behind how they actually do it. My chemistry is a little rusty. But typically, like I said, you can send the soil sample to a soil lab, and they'll definitely do the pH. And there are some home test kits you can buy, if not at Lowe's, then on Amazon or something similar for sure. So any big box store in the garden section will probably have a little pH test kit. Worst case scenario, you can buy some peat test strips pretty readily. I don't want to give inaccurate information, so I'd say, yeah, like there's definitely kits out there that you can buy that are fairly affordable to test just pH. It's pretty cheap. Yes?
So is it best to test the runoff?
You would actually test the soil itself. I usually just send my soil samples off to get tested, so I haven't used one of the little homemade kits, but I've seen them. I'm not exactly sure what they do mechanically, but if I had to guess, it would involve putting some of the soil in water and then testing with some sort of either chemical test strip or something like that. But again, don't quote me on that. Like, you can find something fairly readily. It'll have really easy, simple to understand instructions. It'll just give you a number between 1 and 14, and it's probably going to be in the 6.8 to 7.4 range. In an urban soil, most likely. Yeah.
So I have a one-step process that you can adjust the pH.
Yeah.
So if I test the soil, if the soil is medium or okay, would it be okay if I use that water from my system to just adjust the color 4 or 5?
So the way that you adjust soil pH is through the application of there are certain amendments that you can do if you need to acidify your soil. The traditional way is through elemental sulfur, and there are rates available online that can tell you, how much to add on a per acre or per square foot basis, based on what your pH currently is and what you want it to be. I think OSU Extension has some stuff for that. And if you wanted to increase the pH, if your pH is low, you add lime. Again, the rates and stuff are dependent on what your pH is and what your target pH is. So those are the amendments you would use. You wouldn't just, you wouldn't just add water per se. Those are generally the accepted chemicals that you use to modify soil pH. There's some information out there, about whether or not, say, because traditionally, for example, pine forests have pretty acidic soils. So the thought is, maybe pine needles acidify the soil. Research data isn't necessarily out there for that. Lots of people in the permaculture community stand by that. but I guess I don't have a solid answer on whether those are really a pH lowering thing, but if they are, it's going to be a fairly slow process, whereas with elemental sulfur and lime, it's going to be pretty relatively quick. You know, over a season or a few seasons, you'll be able to adjust the pH pretty reliably. You may end up needing repeat applications as time goes on, as those nutrients wash out with water and things like that. So it's important to regularly test your soil and soil pH to make sure you're in the optimum range. Now, do you have a question too, or? Yeah.
So are you saying that as long as we buy our soil from the store that's already pre-mixed, we should be fine without having to worry about the pH level? And I asked that because when we did our seedling, we did not test.
Yeah, so I mean, for the seed starting mix, it's not a huge issue, and typically the seed starting mixes are in the right pH. They test that and things like that. It's really your soil that's in the ground that you want to be concerned about your pH levels and then modifying that. Like if you're some of the recipes that we talked about in the last class for seed starting, if you're mixing your own, some of those include like adding some lime because peat is pretty acidic. And so, you know, if you're mixing your own, especially if you're doing it on a large scale, then you might want to pH test your soil media or soilless media. But, you know, for a small scale, it's probably not really necessary. And if you're buying your own, you know, that should be, they test it and things like that. So I wouldn't worry too much about it in terms of seed starting mixes. Any other questions? Yeah.
So when you say test the soil regularly, is that like the other once a season, or is it more often?
You know, a lot of farmers traditionally will do it maybe every few years. I would say, yeah, like minimum every third year. Every year is nice. It's not really that expensive to do. Sending a soil sample off, depending on what you're testing, will be anywhere between, and it depends on what you're testing and who you're testing it with, but you know, between $15 and $60, maybe a little more if you're testing for lead or other heavy metals, a little bit extra for doing other nutrients and things like that. And so we can go over how to take a soil test when we go outside in a minute. Well, I guess not necessarily a minute, but pretty quickly here. So here's some example of good and bad soils. So the good soil here, which is on, yes, your left-hand side, you know, you can reach your hand to it. It crumbles really easily, reveals well formed. So by macro aggregates, yes. So there are a number of different options. There's a soil testing lab in Washington Courthouse called Spectrum Analytic. There's also, there are other soil testing labs out there. Since I'm still relatively new to Ohio, I don't know all of them per se. I think up in the Northeast we used a different company. That's the one I know right around here. But you know, you can send them off to. You can send it anywhere if you find a place that prices out. Like it doesn't even across state lines. Like I said, we use Spectrum Analytic for some of the samples we test for people, but they're certainly not the only option. I can come up with a list of different soil sampling places and put it in the handouts. So I'll do that and get that to you, you know, probably later this week. It'll be in the Google Drive. I mentioned that. Has everybody gotten access to the Google Drive? No? Okay. Did you receive an invite or? Okay, because I think I sent it to everybody. But you know, after class, come talk to me. I'll make sure I have your correct email, and then I will get that invite sent to you. You might have to request access from Dana, who is the one who created the Drive folder. Which once you get the invite, it'll say like, hey, you can basically request access, and then you should get let in. So that has all the handouts that we've had. It has all the PowerPoints. It's going to have these videos. You can see we're recording right now, so the videos will be posted there afterwards. So yeah, just talk to me after class. Yeah.
So the question, so on the distribution side of things with FSMA and preventive controls, they want you to look at, for example, the product and look at pH versus water content, determine if it's temperature control for safety. So does the same apply to growing? Because I don't know much about that side, but with growing, if you have low pH, high water content, could there be like negative effects for that? Similar?
So you're talking about testing the actual plants, right? The fruit and things like that?
So like when I had to do a HACCP plan, right, I had to justify temperature control and temperature control for safety, yada, yada, yada. And the best thing I could pull from the FDA was pH versus water content.
Okay.
What they say is you have low pH, high water content, then there's a potential for E. coli, listeria.
Okay, and this is like you're testing, like, if you had an apple, you were like testing part of that apple, or what? Okay.
It gets a little tricky because, like watermelons, for example, the flesh is high water content, but
Yeah.
the skin is not. So it makes it like a nightmare to really scientifically justify it.
Typically what it is for the growing component, your pH really just, it affects nutrient uptake. Because basically if you, so pH is basically a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions, so H positive in the soil, or in whatever it is, or hydrogen and hydroxide, which is OH. So it's the relative balance of hydroxide versus hydrogen ions. And because those have electric charges, that impacts the way in which nutrients, so like basically your cells and cells of plants have different little channels in the walls of the cells that let nutrients and stuff in. And those are affected strongly by electrical charge of the surrounding area. And so the way the charge distribution in the soil might close off some channels at a certain point and open them up at others. Therefore, when your soil is at a varying pH, you have, sometimes you might not take up certain nutrients. That's a very broad idea of what that looks like. Basically, the short of it is pH impacts how the plants take up nutrients. If your pH is off, like I said, you could fertilize it with the best fertilizer ever, but if your pH is wrong, it doesn't do any good because it literally can't pick it up. Is there another question? Okay. So when this mentions macro aggregates, that just means really like nice big clumps of stuff that hold together. That's a clue that there's organic matter, because that organic matter, it's breaking down. There's things like fungi and other things in that soil holding it together. Those big chunks also then have a lot of air in them. They help provide air throughout the soil structure, so that's really nice. Compared to the right is from an intensively tilled field, which is, so, then the soil, it fluffs up, water gets in, it shrinks down, it compacts. It's very clearly like there's not a whole lot of space for air in there. There's not a whole lot of space for water sometimes. So like clearly the soil on the right-hand side, like it's not in the greatest shape right now. Sometimes, so it's mentioning this is soil on the right from an intensely tilled field. Right after tillage, it was probably quite nice. Then as time goes on, if anybody walks on it, if anybody drives on it, as rain beats down, then some issues happen. And we'll talk about that when we talk about tillage in a minute. So this is a fun little slide that Dana found. So on the left-hand side, so basically, there's two pairs of underwear. One of them was buried in a sort of like standard agricultural field, and one of them was buried in a high organic matter, like more, I guess you could say, like sustainably managed field. And you can see this one's breaking down a lot more because there's a lot more living organisms there. They can look at all this and say, aha, food source, let us destroy it and turn it into more of us. Greater biology breaks things down faster. It releases all those things then into the soil. and then provides that nutrients not only to the bacteria and the fungi that do the breaking down, but then as those bacteria grow and reproduce, they die, they get eaten by other things, which get eaten by other things, which get eaten by other things, which then get eaten by us, or maybe 5 or 6 levels in there. So this is an example of like the difference that having a healthy soil biome can make in terms of just breakdown of organic matter and other things like that. Because these underwear are probably cotton, and that's totally an organic material broken down. So in terms of how do we measure soil health, there was a handout that I didn't print. Again, I think I mentioned to some of you who were here earlier, there was a handout that I did not print, but it will be available in the Google Drive. That is from the National Resources Conservation Service, which is a USDA branch. That they have a soil health assessment sort of checklist, and we're going to talk through generally what that looks like. But there's a specific checklist. You can get a soil test done. Keeping records, again, going to harp on this a lot. Keeping records help. If you know what you applied, if you're applying manure, if you're applying fertilizer, if you're applying beneficial nematodes or whatever to your soil. Knowing what you did and when you did it can help you track changes. So, if you have, and then taking your soil test regularly, so you test your soil this year, and one thing we're going to do is we have some soil tests that we took here. I haven't gotten them back yet, but we have some soil tests that we took here. Next year, we're going to take them again, and we're going to compare and see what's changed in the year that you've been managing your plots, for example. And that can help you as you take your soil tests and do that sort of thing. You can track changes in pH. You can track your changes in organic matter. And you can see like, okay, well, this is what I did for my management practice this year. And then as that builds up over time, maybe 3 years from now, you decide to add a whole bunch of manure or wood chips or whatever. And then you can then see how that changes your soil composition afterwards. And it doesn't always have to be this scientific thing where you go and you send it off to somewhere and get a real precise answer. That can be very useful, but you can also do it sort of by hand. Again, this NRCS soil health assessment helps you do that on a more informal basis. But just again, digging into the soil, feeling it, looking at it, looking for life. If you have access to a microscope, checking out and seeing what's alive in there and how that changes. Those are just some ways you can sort of see what's going on. I mean, probably most people don't have microscopes, but maybe you could sneak into a community college science lab and take a little look. There are oftentimes people who have access to scopes who might let you use them in science departments at schools and things like that. So can never hurt to ask, right? In terms of strategies to promote soil health, so this is a nice little wheel diagram here. So provide continuous living roots. So obviously, so one thing that's really important to know is there's a part of the soil, it's called the rhizosphere. In science speak, but in regular people's language, it's basically the place right around plant roots. Plants, their whole deal is they take sunlight and turn it into sugar with a couple other ingredients, which I'm sure you know. They also benefit from a lot of those microorganisms and things in the soil. So what they do is, because sugar, everybody loves sugar, I love sugar, you all probably like sugar for the most part, they secrete sugar from their roots. So right around the roots of every plant is this zone of high concentration of readily available, easily digestible food. And so bacteria, fungi love this stuff. And so having roots in your soil, living roots that are attached to a plant that's photosynthesizing, that helps provide food for your soil microbiome. And that's really a place of great biodiversity and concentration of life in the soil is right around the roots of the plants. So by having continuous living roots, you encourage the growth of microorganisms, which improves the organic matter content of your soil and helps just in general, it helps keep the soil in place, because if roots are holding on to it and all that sugar, it makes things kind of sticky. There's a technical term for it, which now is escaping me, but you basically it glues together in a very loose sense that area, and so the plants hold on to it and the organisms hold on to it. That stops it from running off with water. It stops it from blowing away with wind. So living roots is good. Minimizing disturbance, also good. This in terms of soil health. The more you dig up, the more you can cause some, you're breaking up those roots then. Those will decompose. You're adding more air, which can be very good and very beneficial to your plants. But one thing to think about it is underneath the soil, oxygen is a very limiting factor. And pretty much all of our life needs oxygen to exist and to keep going. There are some things that don't. But generally speaking, like the pace of life underground is dependent on where and how much oxygen there is. And when you suddenly introduce a whole bunch by tilling, by inverting the soil, by doing all this stuff, suddenly everything can explode in growth. And when that happens, then some other nutrient becomes the limiting factor. And then that gets eaten up, and then they run out of stuff to eat. They run out of those other nutrients they need. They starve, they die, that breaks down, that uses up more oxygen. And then you end up getting some problems as the more you disturb. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Maximizing soil cover. So just having plants, so not only just having roots, but having things over the soil, that helps reduce the impact of rain. If it hits a plant leaf before dripping off onto the soil, it's not hitting as hard. That means soil doesn't go flying up and blowing away in the wind of a storm. It also helps reduce the amount of sunlight hitting the soil, which helps keep it more moderate in temperature, which generally most things like to be, standing out in the sun's not fun for us. Doesn't mean necessarily microbes like it either, or worms or anything like that. Having a little bit of shade is always nice for things that are living in and on the soil. Maximizing biodiversity, again, just having that biodiversity there, it helps cushion against pest and disease problems. It helps promote larger scale, life, and is generally just a net positive because different organisms do different things. Worms do their thing, ants do another thing that's similar, beetles do some things. So having more of these things means you get, I guess you could think of it as it's all greater than the sum of its parts. There's all these little pieces that go into it, and the more pieces you have, the greater whole there is to observe and things like that. So some specific strategies, so reduce inversion, tillage, and soil traffic. So by that means really taking the soil from deep down and bringing it to the top. Reducing that will help improve your soil health. And obviously the more heavy equipment we have running on soil, the more you walk over a place of soil, the more compacted it gets. You might notice, if there's a spot of lawn and people are walking across it, you'll notice that spot slowly starts to lose grass and get hard and things like that. So the soil there is going to be less healthy because you're just sort of pressing it down, and you're not. And then it's harder for water to get in, harder for air to get in, and that's just not great for it. Increasing your organic matter also really helps. Again, that helps form aggregates. It encourages other life to come and eat that organic matter and turn it into other little bits and pieces that other things can use. Using cover crops. Has anybody heard the term cover crops before? Yeah? Can you tell? What's a cover crop?
Basically, in between, like say for instance, you grow corn and during the winter you use a cover crop in order to keep your soil aerated and have nutrients. Yeah. So it does all those things. It helps hold the soil in place. It helps provide some organic matter. In the springtime, if you're going to plant corn or soybeans or whatever in that cover crop, you knock down that cover crop, but you don't just haul it out of there. It breaks down and it releases that energy back into the soil. And those things, like the roots of whatever your cover crop is, sometimes those can go down pretty deep. Those can bring nutrients up from the subsoil and bring it to the top of the soil for use by your plants, by other organisms, and other things like that. You can reduce pesticide use and provide habitat for beneficial organisms. This is a way to encourage biodiversity. A lot of pesticides can be targeted, but oftentimes they're targeted at animal families. They're targeted at all caterpillars. So spraying something that targets caterpillars isn't just going to hit your cabbage worms. It can hit other things too. So being careful about your pesticide use and reducing it and providing habitat for other things can help improve your biodiversity, which has long-term benefits. You can rotate your crops. I think I mentioned this before, that like different crops need different nutrients. So by rotating them, you're helping maintain an even balance of nutrients within your soil. And then managing your nutrients well, so only adding extra nutrients when you need them, and adding them at a adding them at a rate that makes sense to what your goals are. Yeah, you can use them as a weed control strategy as well. Because one thing you can do is you can take that cover crop and you can either, there's something called a roller crimper, which you can basically just knock it down, which will, and it'll compress the stem in such a way that the part of the plant that sucks up the water and transfers the nutrients down to the roots, you can break that connection, but still have the whole plant there. So what will happen is the plant will die, but the material will still be there, and that can serve as a sort of a mulch that then you can plant directly in, and then that'll help control the weeds, because then sunlight doesn't reach the surface. You're not tilling up the soil, which can bring up weed seeds and things like that. So it can be used as weed control as well. Also, they can outcompete the weeds. So that way, when if you have a cover crop and say you don't crimp it, but you just mow it and get rid of it, then you can. You're not germinating those weed seeds, or those weed seeds didn't have a chance to germinate. And then you can give your plants a nice fresh start. Other questions? Yes.
Kind of off topic, but as you drive around in Ohio, you see a lot of corn and soybeans.
Mm-hmm.
In those fields, can you grow others? Say if you don't grow corn, you've been growing corn for a long time, but you want to start growing cabbage or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Will that be hard to do based on the soil content from it growing corn all that time?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, so corn is a heavy nitrogen feeder, so you've probably been adding a lot of nitrogen to that soil. So the first thing to do if you want to change crops like that is you want to test your soil, see what the nutrient levels are like, judge based on what your nutrient requirements are for your crops, see what kind of adjustments you make. There's no reason you couldn't do it. It's just you might just need to do a little bit of planning. I mean, even people who grow corn year after year, they're continually checking their fields if they're doing things, smart, because they want to know how to minimize their input costs and maximize their productivity. So, they're monitoring their soil. So, if you're doing that stuff, no matter what you're growing, even if you're growing the same thing year after year, that monitoring is really critical, because, again, your plants take things up, things happen. Weather can impact what your nutrients are looking like. Because if there's a lot of rain and you don't have a very strong, your soil doesn't have a very strong cation exchange capacity, you can't hold on to those nutrients very much. If you get a lot of rain, a lot of those nutrients wash out. If you fertilized right before that lot of rain, then you're going to get runoff and things like that. So, planning around the weather, looking at what you're doing, testing your soils, it's always going to be important no matter what you're growing. And if you change things, it's even more, just more so, because you got to just make sure you're adjusting what your plans were and adjusting for the fact that your new crop might have a different growing habit and different needs. But yeah, you definitely could do it. Okay. So this is a nice point to take a bit of a break. I think, yeah, so let's see, we are at 6 o'clock. So we're gonna, what we're gonna do is take a break, grab something to drink, whatever, and then we're gonna split into groups of, let's say like groups of 4, and we're gonna go outside and sort of look at the soil we've got and do some assessment and evaluating of what our site looks like. Basically, one thing I want you to do is just to walk around our grow site, look in the beds, look in the space between the beds. And so with the flags, everyone can take a flag and just try to poke your flag into the soil. See how deep it goes. This is a real simple way to say, like, okay, like how deep is my soil? Things like that. So, this is a little faster than trying to dig things up. I've also got a shovel I'm going to pull out. With those of you that have the little things of the water container, what I'll show you to do is we're going to do a water infiltration test. So here, if you want to just set that on the ground real quick, what I'd like you to do is you'll just have this, and so you can see, you can use pretty much anything for this. I just took some 20-ounce pop bottles I had in my car, cut the tops off. If you really wanted to be fancy, you could use some sort of like solid cylinder, a bucket that you cut the bottom out of. And this is something you can do throughout the season, or especially as seasons go and you can see how your soil changes. You basically put this flush up against the ground and fill with water to a certain amount, whatever it is, and sort of see how long it takes to drain out. This is very imperfect. In a perfect world, we have something where like it's flush with the level, so that way it doesn't just leak out the bottom. But you can take this and see, so with this you might want to press it down kind of hard, and you can just fill with water, and again just sort of see how long it takes to drain. And that'll tell you something about like the soil composition. If it drains real fast, that means you got a lot of infiltration. You can see how long this is taking right here. So I got this pressed up against here, so like this is telling me, okay, there's probably a fair bit of clay in here.
So maybe the ground is saturated from all the rain.
Also, yes, great thought, yeah. Yeah, it might just be saturated. There might not be anywhere for the water to go. So, when you do this at home, if you use the same thing every time, you fill it up to the same level every time, you can judge how your soil composition is changing, or how the environment that the soil is in has changed. And there are like some fancy tools you can get that actually really measure it, and you can get the actual rate of change. But this is a nice, quick and dirty way to do it on your own, just with a pop bottle or whatever, milk jug. As long as you do the same thing every time, then you can really kind of judge it. And we've been talking here for about a minute, and there's still water on top of here. Again, I'm pressing this down kind of a bit to make sure it's not just leaking out the sides. Yeah, and there we go. So what I'd like you to do is then just sort of go around the field, go to different plots, go between the plots, test what you see, try poking it, try using the water infiltration test, and then we'll come back in 5 minutes or so and talk about what we found. The flags, what you're going to do is you're going to just poke them into the soil in different places, see how deep you can go, see what the soil looks like. And think about what that tells you about what the soil is like. Yeah, so if you're not familiar, this area used to be a pool. So they, right here, especially right by that, that concrete was some walk around by the pool. There used to be a pool building. So this area is very much a lot of fill. And if you're familiar with fill, it is the cheapest of the cheap dirt. So not high quality. It's one of the reasons why we got some extra topsoil and brought it in on top of here. What else did you notice?
A lot of the area over there had pockets of water because the water just couldn't go down.
Okay, cool. All right, how about you? How about this group? What did you notice?
I noticed a lot of rocks.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of clay. Still need to be a little bit more fonder.
Mm-hmm.
Still a little bit more.
Yeah, so clearly this soil, we haven't actually worked it at all really. So we just had a big pile of it. We put it out here and we're just trying to get the tiller, yeah. You guys notice anything?
Yeah. Once you got over into the grass, it only consistently went about that far.
Uh-huh.
Even in the tall stuff over there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Held water too.
Yeah? Yeah, anybody notice differences in, this group? Anything else you noticed that's different than, or did you notice anything else in particular?
That's pretty consistent with what everybody else is doing.
Yeah. Yeah, so for the water infiltration test, if those you got to do it, what did you notice any differences between either side or anything like that?
Certain spots are tested. I mean, it kind of drained a little faster.
Uh-huh.
Other spots you tested, it helped a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is just something you can do throughout your backyard or wherever you grow. You can just so the flags is really just a cheap and easy way, or you can use anything really that has a sharp point that's very fine. Just sort of stick it in and see how deep, just to give you a sense of is the soil easy to move through? Clearly here it's not very easy to move through. So I dug up 3 little bits of soil from different spaces around here. So this was up towards that grass. So you can see it's a little bit more, there's still some nice crumbles. They hold together all right. If I squeeze it, it kind of holds together. So, there might be some clay in here. But there's generally, you can see there's just a lot of roots, a lot of living stuff in here that we can work with. compare that to over here, where this was I got right over here. There's still some things growing, so there's definitely some roots. A lot more rock, a lot of red stuff. Kind of iffy, I don't know. And then this was just right from a straight, wasn't anything growing here. There's a lot of gravel. Doesn't hold together. I mean, like, so there's clearly a lot of clay in the soil. Even in the rough stuff, it clumps together pretty well. So there's definitely a lot of clay here. But like, there's not like hardly anything alive in this part. And you see there's a little bit of a different color. So just like, you know, digging up the soil, looking at like, if you actually, you know, if anybody want to get their hands dirty? Yeah? And nobody wants their hands dirty. Sure. All right, all right, so just feel this a little bit, and then what I'll have you do, you know, you can crumble it up a little bit, and then I will have you compare to this and tell me any differences that you feel.
Okay, that sticks together more like clay, and this is falling apart.
Yeah, so clearly this has a lot more sand in it probably. This has clay, it's got more organic matter, it's stuck together. So yeah, like you can sort of feel it, and really you can just sort of feel differences. How about, do you notice anything different with this bit compared to the other two?
It's not falling together as much or sticking together, but it has a lot of roots in it. It's dry.
Yes.
Which one would have more silk in it?
More silt? Well, it depends. I mean, like it can kind of vary. So like you'll often get variables throughout your grow space, where you might have one end of your field that's more clayey, one that's less. Generally, like from what I've seen, Ohio has generally fairly clayey soils for the most part, unless you're by the lakes. But you can when you get soil tested, there are some labs that will do a physical test, will tell you your composition of sand versus silt versus clay. In general, like what you sort of like, if you have a fair amount, if your water takes a little while to infiltrate, that tells you probably got at least some clay and silt in there. If it just goes right through, you're probably mostly in sand. You can sort of look, and if it holds together really well as you squeeze it, you definitely know there's some clay there. I mean, you can, and just sort of looking at the fact that there's a lot of life in here tells you that there's going to be more organic matter in this particular patch compared to some of the other ones. In terms of just identifying what's what, you can't really do that without a microscope or anything like that, but you can just sort of look and see, like, look at water infiltration, look at if there's not a lot of stuff growing, clearly there's some problems. If there's, grass or whatever growing, like, that tells you there's definitely conditions that are good for plants. Whether it's good for your crops, that's sort of another matter, but this is a nice little sort of shorthand way just to look at and say, like, okay, yeah, like, this is a nice living soil, whereas that one was kind of like a dead kind of, what is this, I don't know, sort of thing.
What power microscope would you need to look at that?
You could probably get by with what's called a dissecting scope, obviously, which is, I think, maybe 10 to 20x. Or 10 to 50. There's a lot of scopes out there that go, 10, 100, 1,000. You don't need to, I mean, the higher you go, the more minute detail you can look at, obviously, but like, I guess I don't have a solid answer for you on that off the top of my head. But even like, I think like you could probably get by looking with a dissecting scope and see some fair amount of detail. Could you use a jeweler's loupe? Probably. I mean, any magnification can help, especially really in terms of looking at particle size, I don't know how much of a difference that would make, but like, even a jeweler's loupe or anything like that could be good for looking at like little, little organisms like collembola and things like that. So little tiny bugs that you can't see very easily that live in the soil. It's always fun to look at things with any sort of magnification, I find, and you can just sort of get a sense of what things are looking like and just get a little fun ideas of what's out there and in your soil that's not just roots and things like that. I wanted to go quickly over soil sampling. So this is what's called a soil probe. This is a really handy tool for soil samples. You can just use a shovel and just dig down a bit. The main thing with soil sampling, whether you use a shovel or a probe, so a probe, what you do is, I'm going to go to a place where it's going to be a little easier to go in. Let's try right here. So the probe, you just sort of press it down. Okay, yeah, that gets only about that far. This is another way to get to sort of tell how the soil is looking. That went a little better. So this is fairly typical of urban soils. There's oftentimes a lot of fill. You know, there might have been buildings there. You can look up the history of your property and see where buildings used to be and things like that. That can be a real helpful guide on where to look to grow things. Ah, there we go. That's a bit better. All right. Yeah. So you can see I pressed this down here. In an ideal world, like, you know, all right, yeah, you can twist a bit, but you can see sort of like the profile of the soil here. But in general, when you're taking a soil sample with one of these, you take a probe like that, so that went down a bit. And then what you do is, so, you know, my first sample was here. And you can sample as big or as small of an area as you like. But again, and this is what you'll do with shovels or whatever, you know. If I was gardening in a space, you know, maybe just like, okay, I'm not going to do this to scale just so we have an idea, but like, you know, let's say it was across your yard. You know, what you want to do is you take your sample here, you have the core, you put that in a bag. You do a walk over here, diagonal line, take another core. Try to get it, ideally like 6 inches. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. You'll take out the core. Sometimes I end up doing like pushing the bottom part out with my finger a lot, or like another little tool. And then you'll zig over here. And basically you do a zigzag pattern. A lot of times you'll go like here, here, there, zig, zig, zig. Get like 10 cores for whatever area you're looking at. And then that's your sample, because you want to create a representative sample of your garden space. Obviously you can do it in a smaller area if you wanted to. But like soils don't, like there's always variability, but they don't change that much on sort of like a yard scale or a field scale. Oftentimes farmers will do a set of samples across several acres and just periodically take a core, zigzagging across the field, trying to get a representative average look at what the field looks like in terms of soil. And then that's what they send off to get tested. So if you're doing shovels, you're going to dig down about 6 inches and take a scoop of that soil, put it in your bag, again, and zigzag across your grow space.
Do you want to put it in separate bags as you're doing your samples? If you do one here and then you do one 50 feet away, put it in a separate bag?
Depends on if you want to consider those two different fields or not. Like, so for this area here, I ended up doing 3 different samples. I did one from the road over to here. I did one from the middle, like near the concrete, over to here, and then I did on that side from the road over to here. So I did 3 broad samples. But I could have done just one sample for the whole space if I wanted. One thing to kind of look like, so, you know, I noticed out here, like, you know, the soil's generally deeper up here. It wasn't in a building before. And like that soil over there is a little bit more rocky and clearly has a lot of backfill that's kind of not great quality. So I tested 3 samples just to look at the different disparities I noticed based on the physical characteristics when I went out to do my site evaluation, just like we just did with the flags and the water and things like that. So, you know, if you're doing it in a home garden, you know, for example, you might want to test your flower beds and your vegetable garden separately, because you might have different nutrient requirements and things like that for your vegetables than your flowers. But what's that?
Code them too, so you know what's what.
Yeah. When you submit your soil samples, you give sample name for whatever it is, and again, your sample can cover as wide or as small of an area as you want. Just remember, they do cost money to get tested, so if you have a backyard that you're growing in, one sample is probably going to be fine, unless you really wanted to dig down in the difference between your like flower beds. If you wanted to do a lot of, say, like hydrangeas, which need a special pH to really bloom the right bloom the right way, you might test your hydrangea bed separately, because you want to know your management that you need to do to lower that pH. But if you're just doing like garden vegetables in your backyard, you could just test your backyard as a whole unit. Again, you can always get more fine detail, but probably in a backyard, you're not going to have that much difference from your front yard to your backyard. Probably not that different. There are places you can look at. There's, broadly speaking, across the United States, there's lots of different soil types. And these have different characteristics. I'm not going to go into it too much because there's dozens and dozens of them. Ohio has, I don't remember exactly how many, but like several different soil types, broadly speaking. There exists a soil survey. You can look and find what the soil type is on your property. You can look this up and find out what the soil type is. That can tell you general information about like what the expected amount of clay and silt and things like that. Like there's physical characteristics. You can find that info out. Yeah. I'm trying to remember if it's under the USDA or the US Geological Survey. Give me 1 second, I'll look it up.
There's the soil and water place over on Amity Road, and if you go there, they will actually print out a map of your place for you and tell you the different soil types in there.
Okay, yeah, great, yeah.
Where's that place again?
It's, I think it's Montgomery County Soil and Water, and it's over on Amity Road. So right when you cross Clayton Road and Little Richmond becomes Amity, it's right there on the right.
Great. For those of you who are listening at home or not here, so the Soil and Water Conservation or Soil and Water District for Montgomery County can give you your soil map and tell you about your soil types and things like that. This information also is available in the USDA NRCS Web Soil Survey. You can type in your address and find it, and you can always ask if you pull that information up. They have guides and things like that, but it's also very technical. But you can call the Soil and Water, and they can give you some more information about what all those technical definitions mean and things like that, if you didn't want to just go there and ask them directly.
Two questions on testing.
Yeah.
One, do you have to clean between samples, and then two, do you need to take any precautions with hands?
No, you don't need to clean between samples. It's not going to be that big. You're going to have enough soil because you're going to be sending to their soil for the soil sample. You're going to be sending several cups worth of soil. The little bit that's on the, if you pop out between, I wouldn't worry too much about contamination. I mean, unless you got like a bad disease issue in one field, and then, I would sanitize. In terms of your hands, the only thing I would be concerned about is if you think you're operating in an area with very heavy lead. Then you might wear gloves, but even then, I'm not sure of how lead uptakes through the skin. I know it's bad if you ingest it. I don't know if you just touch it, if it's necessarily as bad. But obviously then, if you're touching the soil and you put your hand in your mouth, I mean, especially if you have kids around, I think definitely keep their hands clean and things like that if you're worried about lead contamination in soil and things like that. Good question. I'm not sure. Probably, yeah, it's always a good idea to wash your hands before you put them on your face if you've been dealing with dirty stuff. I don't know, I know there's, what is it, the trichinosis goes through the skin, but I don't know how common that is. I don't think that's really a big deal in the urban soils, at least the trichinosis. I don't know about worms. I think tapeworms you have to ingest. I think there's the trichinosis worms, which can just go through skin contact. But again, that's really not something you find, I think, in urban soils. But I guess don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure. So I would say that'd be something we would need to look up to have a better answer.
And just to confirm, there would be no concerns like cross-contaminating samples?
No, not realistically. Like not for the little amount of soil you might get in between. I mean, if you're worried about it, you can always clean it. I don't think it's necessary, strictly speaking. All right, we're gonna pop back inside now. Thanks for coming out and getting a little dirty, folks. I'm gonna kind of zip through the bed preparation thing because we didn't have the beds prepared for you to look at and really talk about in detail. Well, we can tell what wasn't good about their beds. So one thing is, so when we prepare beds, any amendments that we want to apply, I would probably actually put that second. So any amendments that we want to apply, we want to add, as we prepare the bed before we really get started with going. So, if you need to modify the pH, you're going to add your sulfur or your lime or what have you before you do any tillage or anything like that. If you're adding manure or fertilizer or anything like that, it's not a liquid injected one, applying that first, especially if you're doing things like blood meal or whatever, having that on top, and then when you mix it in, then that mixes that throughout the soil, so you get even distribution of nutrients, which is important. Helps reduce the nutrient runoff and things like that. So obviously you want to make sure you want to kill your grass or sod if you're starting fresh. So that might mean plowing and turning it over. It might mean tilling. It might mean covering with a tarp and letting that kill the grass and then planting in it. It might be, I'm going to try an experiment in my backyard as I'm going to grow some things. I'm just going to straight up remove the sod. I'm going to rent a sod cutter and just pull it out and leave it and replace it with compost. I'm not sure how that's going to work. We're going to see. It's going to be an experiment. So shaping or marking, and or marking the bed. So if you're doing like the raised beds and you have a bed shaper, you've loosened up the soil, then you can run that shaper through, or if you just want to do it on flat ground, just marking where your beds are going to be. Again, this is important. We talked about how having a consistent bed size helps you plan, helps you be consistent, so that way you can work through what you need for every bed easily. Instead of trying to say, like, oh, I've got this one bed and it's like 3 feet by 70 feet, and I've got this other bed and it's like 6 feet by 10 feet. Just be consistent. It makes your life a lot easier, makes the math easier. As I was talking with our farmers, there's a lot of math involved in farming. You might not think it, but it's there. So one thing to help is also to loosen up the soil. So if you haven't tilled a lot or anything like that, like if you have, as somebody mentioned, when you notice you're sticking those flags in there, it got pretty hard pretty quickly. So you can break that up a bit. You can use what's called a subsoiler, which grows deep under the ground and helps lift up the soil, but doesn't actually disturb the top all that much. You can use a broad fork, which is kind of a manual way to do it. It's basically, think of like a big rake, except for the tines all go straight and they're big and heavy duty. So you set it on the ground, you step or even jump on it to push it in, wiggle it back and forth, pull it out, walk forward, do it again, wiggle it back and forth. That can be a kind of intense process, but if you want to do no-till, for example, that's one of the ways you do it. That helps aerate the soil, adds that oxygen that your plants things need, but you're not disturbing the soil all that much. You're not reducing the biology, like I told you about how if you add all the air, you're not getting an explosive growth and then die-back. So it's a way to help improve growth and improve aeration, improve water infiltration without necessarily all the drawbacks of intense tillage. Now, obviously, it doesn't add as much air as tillage, for example, and it doesn't do a whole lot. It doesn't do a whole lot for the rest of the soil structure, or I guess like it doesn't make like that nice fluffy bed, which can be really nice for planting in. But again, there are some other options. So we want to even out and smooth the surface. So you might have noticed, like the beds that we have started making out there, they're pretty bumpy and rough. So we did they were even worse before. We did a light disking of them to break up some of those clods. But we might want to use a disc, a harrow, a till to smooth it out, or if you're doing it by hand, you can hoe it, you can rake it. There are companies that sell small hand, or I guess not necessarily small, but like personal-sized tools to smooth out a bed. Johnny's has some on their tool part of their website. Again, you just make it nice and flat and smooth. That helps, again, it helps your seeds contact the soil. And that's really what's critical about getting your seeds to germinate, especially in a direct seeded crop, is that you want to have that seed in contact with the soil. If it's just sitting on a little bit of soil and there's air all around it, it's probably not going to grow because that water is not really going to stay in contact with it. The seed isn't going to imbibe that water and not going to start that rapid growth. You want to add irrigation after your bed is really kind of prepped, and then you want to install mulch if you're using it, whether that's landscape fabric, whether it's plastic mulch, whether it's wood chips or leaves or whatever. That's sort of your last step after you've built the bed and seen it. So we'll take a look once the beds out here are a little bit more finished. Like right now, there's beds out there. We put them there because we saw the soil quality out there isn't great. And even then, we're going to add some compost to those beds. And so then we're gonna break up those clods, smooth it out, make it nice and pretty, and then we'll see a little bit more of what this looks like. Yes.
What do you mean by adding irrigation?
Okay, so actually, we're going to talk about. There's going to be a whole section of this on irrigation. So give me 1 second. We'll talk about what that looks like. But basically, like the idea is like once your bed is mostly shaped, before you cover anything else, you want to make sure that so one thing we primarily use in vegetable agriculture, we use something called drip irrigation, which looks kind of like this. This is a very short demo. So this little tape fills with water, and there's little holes at certain spacing that then the water drips out onto the soil, usually ideally right where your plant is. It's a way to conserve water. It's a way to not overwater, and we'll talk about it more in just a second. But you have to have this, if you're using, say, plastic mulch or landscape fabric or leaves or anything like that, you want this underneath your mulch, because that way it's going to be right close to your roots, and especially if you're using, say, like plastic mulch, having this on top of your plastic is not really going to help because it's not going to go through the plastic. So, okay, tillage. Let's talk about tillage real quick. So tillage is the process of mixing or inverting the soil. Here you see a picture of somebody using a walk-behind tractor, which is kind of like a really intense rototiller, except for you can change the attachments on it to till the soil. And we'll get to play around with some walk-behind tractors in future classes. So when is tillage useful? It's useful to increase decomposition of the soil. Again, oxygen is that limiting factor. If you've got a lot of organic matter in there, like let's say I mentioned to one of you before the break, that if you're using sorghum Sudan grass to add organic matter to the soil, add biomass to your soil, you're chopping that down, you're mixing it in, you're chopping it down several times, you're just getting all this stuff in there. But it's kind of hard to work with when it's just stalks of grass. Like it's hard to plant in, hard to grow in. So if you want to improve your decomposition to make the soil a little bit more easy to work with, you can till that in. It'll increase the oxygen, then all the microorganisms that eat that grass will have that oomph. They'll decompose your grass a little faster. And then if you reduce your tillage after that, then you can get more stable and things like that. You're reducing disturbance later, but you've added that big food source right away. So it can also be really useful to help speed up your bed prep. It really provides a very nice, even, fluffy seed mix to work with. So again, that is something that's very critical for getting good seed establishment. It can also be used to kill small weeds on the surface. So if you've got very small weeds that are maybe this big, less than an inch tall or so, you can just run a quick till over it to knock them down instead of standing there hoeing. It can be a lot faster. It can let you do a bigger area more quickly or by yourself that you couldn't do if you were just trying to hoe it. But it does have downsides. So again, if you fluff it up and then it rains, it can sink in quite a bit. It can lead to more compaction. It can lead to a hard pan that develops, which is just hard to work in. It becomes more susceptible to erosion because, again, it's nice and light and fluffy, so rain will wash it away. Wind will blow it away. It'll bring weed seeds that are not on top up to the top because you're tilling and you're taking stuff from the top, putting it on bottom, stuff from the bottom, putting it on top. That's what those rotating blades of your tiller do. So you might take care of your weeds right now, but you might increase your weed problem later depending on what the weed seed bank in your soil looks like. A seed bank, if you're not familiar, is just like it's the existing set of seeds that nature has put in wherever you're growing. And it does, so maybe you don't want to break down the organic matter in your soil right now. Maybe you're not adding a whole lot, maybe you have some in there, but you want to keep it there because it's providing that important nutrient capacity and aeration capacity enhancement, and you don't want to get rid of that by breaking it down. So there's a compromise here. So I think there's some folks who are very much like tillage all the time, only till, all good. There's some folks who say you should never till, it's terrible, I will never do it. I think it's a tool. It can be used well. It can be used poorly. It can be really useful to start a field that hasn't been cultivated before. It can be useful to incorporate amendments. Where if you need to adjust the pH of your soil, for example, like just setting your sulfur and lime on top really doesn't cut it. You can till not as much. You can only till maybe a couple inches, really raise that tiller up when you're doing it. That can help reduce that impact on soil life. One thing also that tillage does that I didn't mention on the slides here is how many of you know about fungi and how fungi grow? Not a lot of folks, kind of, maybe. So just a very brief introduction to fungi. So the part of fungi that we see and we eat, mushrooms or whatever, that is maybe 1% of the fungus organism. Fungi live a lot under the soil. Okay, so not all of them, but there's a lot of fungi that live under the soil in long root-like structures called hyphae. And these hyphae together form something called mycelium, which is basically the bulk of a fungus organism. And this mycelium, I want to say I've read somewhere that some of the largest organisms in the world are just fungal mycelial colony patches that cover square miles of area, where it's all genetically the same, but you don't really see it because it's all underground, and just you see a mushroom pop up every once in a while. These strands, actually, there's a lot of fungi that have symbiotic relationships with plant roots, especially in perennials, less so in annuals, but some in annuals. And these symbiotic fungi actually can merge into the root structure of the plants and basically serve as a way to extend the plant root structure much farther. And they help collect, the fungi actually collect nutrients for the plants in exchange for sugar. But when you till and things like that, you're breaking up these fungal mycelial strands, which then changes the nature of the microbiome of your soil. It makes it more bacterial versus fungal. And there's different impacts of that. Fungi, for example, are very good at decomposing plant material, especially like wood and things like that, which bacteria can't do. And so that by tilling, you can affect that fungal versus bacterial balance. But if we only till the top 2 inches, that means there's a lot more space for fungi to grow and other things to grow without being disturbed too much, and it still allows you to prepare that nice seed bed. You can also till if till only if you have to, or use a subsoiler or broad fork to help reduce the impact of that compaction and things like that by lifting up the under parts of soil. So a subsoiler is something, I think, did I describe what a subsoiler does already? Okay, I'm kind of yeah.
So you said still only the top 2 inches of soil, so roots don't need that much. They don't need that.
Well, the idea is that you're tilling primarily because you want that seed contact. The soil underneath, if there's a hard pan, for example, that's when you would use something like a subsoiler to help break up that pan. and allow root infiltration without doing a whole lot of inverting of the soil and bringing up weed seeds from the bottom to the top. The subsoiler basically just goes in and it breaks and lifts up the soil from the bottom. So that then lets water go through and air in and things like that, but without actually moving the soil across. But one thing that happens is if you don't disturb the soil, for example, without tillage, that doesn't mean that underneath those 2 inches it's not usable. If you're having fungal growth, if you're having a lot of microbial activity and life in there that's not getting chopped up by the tiller and things like that, those create their own paths. Worms will grow through, ants will create paths. Anywhere that there's been glaciers in this country, worms are not technically native to. So that's just a fun little thing. That doesn't mean worms are necessarily an invasive species, but it is just a little tidbit. Ants can do the same sort of thing that worms do. You get fungi going in there and they're not being disturbed. So you actually can see improved soil quality, and that breaks down, it creates its own aggregates as living things live and eat and die in there. And that actually improves the physical structure of the soil as well as the biological structure of the soil. So just because you only till the top 2 inches doesn't mean that underneath part is unusable or hard on plants. It's just a little bit different. And sometimes it can take a little while for it to get to the point where it's as high quality and easy for the plants to infiltrate with roots and things like that. If you're starting off with very rough soil, sometimes it can be a challenge to get to that point. So I think I've mentioned my background is primarily in tillage-based vegetable production. I've got a strong and growing interest in no-till, but it's not one of my expertises, so I don't want to say something that's not really correct. But the general idea is that you can manage it in such a way that you are minimizing the tillage impacts, but still getting the benefit of having that little nice seed area to work with. Does that help? Make sense?
My other question is for those who, if you do a container garden, what determines the quality of the soil? How do you, because I've been watching some videos and they're saying even your soil at home in rural areas isn't of good quality, so your vegetables are not really.
So container gardening has its main limits are that you're ending up you probably end up watering more, so there's more risk of compaction within the pot than you would out in the field. There's not a lot of microbiome there. I think the idea is you don't just go take your soil from the garden and throw it in a pot. You can modify it. The big thing with container gardening is that drainage can be a big issue. So you can mitigate this by layering the bottom of your pots in gravel or something like that, or sand, to help improve the drainage. I guess. I would say the biggest thing with container gardening and why you might use just some potting soil or whatever instead of just digging up out of your yard would be concerns about weeds and concerns about having an uneven distribution of soil aggregates and things like that. But there's no reason you couldn't potentially use it, mix it in with some sand or some other things just to give it a little bit more a little bit better drainage. Really kind of depends on your soil. I guess I'm not sure exactly what the resources you were saying were going into detail in terms of problems with. And again, container gardening I wouldn't say is a specialty of mine, so I'm not 100% sure. I can look into it a little bit more and get you some more info next class if you like. Okay. And did you have a question? Okay. Yeah.
Earlier, would it be safe to say that you would mainly want to apply that to the top 2 inches, whereas maybe not disturbing under that's more important than the top side of the soil?
So in terms of the impacts of oxygen and decomposition and things like that, the main issue is, in terms of why you might The main issue of why, like, if you're trying to compromise on tillage, why you only till the top 2 inches is you want that benefit of that nice seed bed, but you want to, for most of the soil, the majority of the soil, instead of 6 to 8 inches down, doing that inversion, you want that to maintain all the microbiome that provides the biodiversity and habitat and things like that for your plants. There's still going to be plenty of infiltration and things like that in there if you're not compacting your soil and stepping all over it and running over it with machinery and whatnot. So, I think, like, I guess, like, if you're tilling the top 2 inches, yeah, you're having some of those issues with breakdown of organic matter there. But, earthworms and things that are in that, below that 2 inches, they're going to come up into that soil. They're going to take your organic matter, bring it down. Other insects will do the same thing. Life in the soil doesn't just stay on one level. It goes up and down throughout the soil column. So, having a deeper bed of biologically active soil can be beneficial and help mitigate the detrimental effects of tillage in the top 2 inches. So, it's all trade-offs. But I think, do you feel like that answered your question? Yeah, okay.
A lady at my work is actually planting in straw bales.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that, and yeah, so then you just have to be, then your fertility is the big issue because straw obviously doesn't have any nutrients in it. So, but yeah, you can do that because straw holds water and it holds the plants, and like as long as you're adding fertility, then they're going to be fine. Yeah. Right, plants need nutrients as well as water and sunlight and a space to grow. So, like, if you're growing in just a straw bale, the straw, provides that structure. You dig a hole in it, you put your potted plant in there. It has that little bit of media. That straw is going to gradually break down and things like that, but it's loose enough in its organic materials, like, the roots can grow through it just fine, and it holds on to water pretty well. But straw, plants don't digest dead plant material. That's what fungi do primarily, and other organisms. So in order to make sure your plant has all the nutrients that it needs, you need to add fertilizer if you're doing a straw bale garden like that.
So there's no dirt underneath the straw?
Well, there's dirt underneath the straw. Maybe, you could put it right on concrete, you could put it on a lawn. But what they're doing is they're basically taking a straw bale garden. It's like you have a straw bale, maybe it's up to here. You're just planting in the actual bale of straw itself. So maybe you're digging a hole through that bale of straw about this deep or whatever. Maybe you're putting a little potting soil or soil media around the plant to hold it in place. But then that's all that there is. And probably like your annual vegetables. Typically, the roots on an annual vegetable only go down about like so. Some go a little deeper, some go shallower. Lettuce only goes, I guess they'll have some that's long, but for the most part, it's pretty shallow. So in that case, obviously, like, it's not getting any nutrients from the soil really, because your straw bale's too deep for the roots to go all the way through. So weeds are our biggest challenge as, well, not necessarily just organic farmers and also just like small scale vegetable farmers. Weeds are one of the biggest challenges. So good bed prep helps control the weeds, because you're managing it before you get the seeds in, and then there's not weeds growing when you put the seeds in. So, timing your bed shaping and bed preparation. And as you go through the season, if you're doing a successional crop where you're doing something in the spring and then something in the summer and then something in the fall or what have you, you do a little bit of bed prep in between. You clean up that bed. Maybe you re-tarp it, let things break down. You re-broad fork it. Maybe you till it again if you're tilling. You prepare the bed multiple times in order to reduce competition with your desired crop. Other things that you can do to control weeds, so when you're making a bed, you can use plastic mulch. We have a plastic mulch layer and things like that we're going to experiment with out here. You can use landscape fabric, which is permeable but serves the same function. You just have to burn holes of it instead of cutting holes in it. Stale seed bedding is where you cover with a tarp. You sort of solarize and kill anything that's growing in there because it gets so hot that, well, it stays moist and warm, so seeds start to grow, but then they get no more rain, it gets too hot and they die. That's a stale seed bed technique. So that's a way to do it. That's a way to just sort of clear the space of weeds and things like that and prepare your space. So these are just different things you can do as part of bed prep, because this helps you manage your beds and keep your weeds down. Yeah, so if you're doing no-till, you might tarp to smother things, let them grow up and then kill them. You'll broad fork. You might do sheet mulching, also called lasagna mulch or lasagna gardening, where you're doing different combinations of different types of organic matter that you then let break down. One of the traditional ones that I've seen is, you put down a layer of cardboard over some sod, you put down some manure, then you put down straw, and then some like nitrogen of some kind, like blood meal, and then maybe a little bit more soil, and then some more straw. Keep it wet and let it break down and decompose. There's other ways to do that as well, but it's a way to sort of basically build up a whole bunch of soil by mixing carbon and nitrogen sources, and then taking advantage of the fact that that's going to decompose and create soil, and then you're basically just building soil on top of an existing structure. That's pretty labor intensive, and if you're doing a large area, it can get quite expensive quite fast, but it is an option. Straw bale gardening is kind of an example of that. That's sort of like really just doing it right in the straw, and then eventually that straw is going to break down over time. So now we're going to get into irrigation. Most crops in Ohio need at least 1 to 2 inches of water per week from May through September. Do you think you're going to need irrigation in this state? No? Well, even in August? Late July? Yeah. So irrigation, like, you don't always need it. I've worked on farms that they didn't irrigate, and it worked out okay for them. I've also worked on farms where, we really had to irrigate, otherwise bad things happened, and in various parts of the Midwest. In general, it's better to have irrigation set up and not need it than need it and have to set it up in a rush and before your plants die. So that's why it's an important part of bed preparation, is getting your irrigation set up ahead of time. So this is just some information about how much water different crops need. So like it's generally like, some crops only need 1 inch of water a week, things like lettuce and beans. Other things are a bit more water heavy, your nightshades, some of the brassicas. And this is not a whole lot. I mean, in general, like I said, like going for like 1.5 inches of rain or irrigation a week is ideal. And now the main thing is, like, we might get, maybe you get 3 inches of rain in 1 week, but if that's all on one day and then it doesn't rain for the next while, you still might need to irrigate. This slide is all available too on the thing, so you'll have access to all this stuff too. And there's I think the one handout that you have today that wasn't the evaluations is about irrigation needs of different crops. Yes. Nightshades is things in the nightshade family, so tomatoes, eggplant, peppers. Those are the potatoes. So those crops. No, it's just it just needs more water. They're just called nightshades because there's a type of plant called nightshade in that family. It's poisonous. So if you're not familiar with it, tomatoes, potatoes, all that are originally from Central and South America. So Italian food, before people came to the U.S. was way different because there were no tomatoes in Europe before the late 1500s or before the 1500s. And initially, people didn't want to eat tomatoes because they thought they were nightshades and thought they were poisonous.
This is based on perfect soil, right? Like if you had sandy soil.
Yeah, this is based on perfect soil. So if you had sandy soil, yeah, if it's not holding on to the water, you obviously need to water a little more. I say, yeah, that's the, or I guess, yeah, or, I'm going I'm going the wrong way. All right, hold up, yeah. Yeah, and so like just because, just because this is what they need, what they actually get might be a little different. So I think this is average monthly precipitation in Dayton, Ohio. So, you know, typically most months you get precipitation of some kind between 2 and 4 inches. So, you know, that seems pretty good, but, you know, sometimes that doesn't always come in a way that's reliable for growing. But also you just generally want to think of like, so this is correction factors. The general idea is that just because it rains an inch doesn't mean that's how much water your plants are getting. Some of that runs off. Maybe it goes through in certain soils. So I guess in here, like it's generally thinking like, you know, if you get 1 inch of rain, you multiply by the correction factor of 0.6. Because you think basically, the more rain we get, the less rain actually goes into the soil because it saturates and the rest runs off. And the soil can only hold so much water. And so basically the more rain you get, the more that runs off. So you think if you get 1 inch of rain, that means you probably really only actually get 0.6 inches of rain in terms of watering your crops. So that's one thing to think about. You know, and so again, this is all going to be on the slide, so you'll have access to in the drive. Equivalent of 1 inch of rainfall would be 7 to 8 hours of drip irrigation or 6 to 8 hours of micro sprinkler. Now, this doesn't mean that when you run your drip irrigation, you're going to run it for 6 to 8 hours, 7 to 8 hours at a time. That's how much you might run it across the week. You might irrigate 2 or 3 times a week. So that way you're getting more reliable water occasionally. It really kind of, it sometimes depends on your crop, but in general, yeah, you can 1 inch of rainfall is equivalent to 7 to 8 hours of drip irrigation or 6 to 8 hours of micro sprinkler using. There's basically the 2 most efficient ways to deliver water to your vegetable crops are through drip irrigation or through micro sprinklers. If you're watering by hand for a commercial scale growing, something is wrong. Yeah, it takes up a lot of time. It's not efficient. You're much better off having something else do the work for you. So we'll talk a little bit more about micro sprinklers in a later class because we'll demo some of those. We'll have them on hand. But the general idea is drip irrigation is stuff that you want for when you water things that you don't want water on the leaves because it promotes disease, like we talked about in the greenhouse class. So things like tomatoes and peppers and squashes and things. Most of your big fruiting crops, you want to water right at the plant level. It helps reduce waste of water because anything the water that's on the leaves is just going to evaporate. Your plant isn't really going to take up all that much from they technically do take up a little, but it's not really an efficient use of water. Like they'll get that from their roots. Whereas micro sprinklers are typically things you want to water stuff that where you have just a lot of plants in a single bed when you're doing, say, like baby greens or carrots or beets or things like that, where just like running drip can sometimes be problematic because there's just so many plants in there. Also, it's really useful for crops that need to have temperature control because if they get water on the leaves and it's okay with them, it doesn't give them a disease problem, so like lettuces and things like that, that helps keep them cool. Lettuces, as we mentioned before, are a cool weather crop. They don't like it hot. You can grow them for a longer period of time if they're evaporatively cooling themselves. It's like how we sweat. Plants can't do that, but by sprinkling them, we can mimic that. And it's like watering them by hand, but instead you have sprinklers to do it. You know, and the nice thing about the reason they're called micro sprinklers is they spray a kind of finer droplet of mist. Also, they're generally very small. Your micro sprinkler might only cover an area about like this, but you have several down your row of crops, and that covers your beds. And it's not like your typical sprinkler where you're going, that wastes a lot of water because it's going all over the place, and it's not really targeting your crop. So by having your lower down, smaller little micro sprinklers, that helps target the water, reduces your waste, keeps them nice and cool, and keeps them in water. Yes?
Would you recommend having a combination of both if you have different plants?
Yes, yeah, you use different types of irrigation for different crops, yes. So yeah, if you're doing, say, spinach, micro sprinklers is what you want to do on your spinach beds, for example, probably. You can do drip on a lot of things you would do micro sprinklers for. You can do it. It just sometimes becomes a little problematic. If you have a 3-foot bed and you're doing 4 or 5 rows of lettuce in it, then trying to put 4 or 5 rows of drip tape is not really effective.
Is it difficult to have drip irrigation or?
No, it's really pretty easy. And I'm going to go into a little bit more about how we go about it, and you'll get to play around with some of the components of it in just a second. How do we know when to water? So, you might want to know, a bigger crop as it gets from, it needs more water as it gets bigger because there's more water. Water is life. A bigger plant needs more water to survive. As it's making fruit, it needs more water. A lot of our components of fruit is water as it grows. Though sometimes you can have too much water. That's what causes cracking in tomatoes if there's a whole bunch of rain all at once, for example. That's one thing that happens. If you get a bunch of rain in a week, you might not need to water. So, obviously paying attention to the weather is very critically important. You can sort of check the soil as if the soil feels moist and feels saturated, you don't need to water. You can sort of eyeball it that way. The best approach is to have a regular watering schedule and then skip that if you if it is raining enough. Whether that is by, either you just go out and physically turn them on, or you have a timer for your irrigation system. You can buy little timers that you can plug into your hose that will set it and allow it to run for a certain amount of time. You can get really fancy ones that you can program to say, all right, I'm going to irrigate Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. and that's what I'm going to do. So there's varying levels of fanciness. Or you can just have it where you just go out and turn on the hose at one point and then just remember to turn it off. Just make sure you set yourself an alarm to remind yourself. So yeah, you can obviously checking the weather is very important. Weather.gov is a really great resource. They've got a lot of really specific info about how much rain is going to happen. And the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration is where every other weather app gets their base data from. Then they make interpretations. So you can just go right to the source. Weather.gov, you can do it by zip code. It's really easy to work with. And yeah, the nice thing about it is that it'll tell you you're going to get less than 1/10 of an inch, or you're going to get 1 to 2 inches, or 1.5 inches, or whatever. So very handy. So the components of an irrigation delivery system, you have your water source. So that could be your hose tap, it could be a pond, it could be a spring, it could be a stream. For most of you here, you probably have city water. So that means you probably won't necessarily need a filter. If you're doing well water or anything like that, it can be really useful to have a filter because oftentimes there's a lot of solid particles and those can clog up your hoses, can clog up your drip line. So having a filter can be very important if you're using a source of water that has the potential for physical contamination. You also want one of these. This is a pressure regulator. Water comes out of your pump or your hose tap or anything like that, typically anywhere between 30 and 60 psi. That's a pretty high psi. A lot of your irrigation supplies cannot stand that. It'll cause them to burst or rupture or anything like that. So you get a pressure regulator like this, and you just tap it into your hose line or whatever. You can either have it right at the source, or you can have it right next to where the water. I usually like to do it if I have my hose going somewhere and then I have my irrigation set up, I have it right there. So to regulate the pressure right as it goes into the line. But either one works just fine. Generally, you want your water pressure to be 10 to 20 psi. So this is this is a 12 psi pressure regulator. Yeah. So having one of these is really important for maintaining the structural integrity of your irrigation system. You have a main line. That is this big pipe right here. So this is just a plastic. There's other types of tubes that do it. This is a really simple one. This is 1.5 inches, or no, this is 1 inch. Inch and a half. This is called oval tube or whatever. So this is your main line. So your hose or whatever it is runs into this. This fills up with water. Generally, the farther away from your water source, the bigger line you want, just to make sure it fills up enough and gets your pressure good. So then you need valves. Well, I guess a drip and header connector. So basically what you have is you have this main line, and what you do is every time you have a row of crop, you pop in one of these. And now this little thing, well, I guess I'll pull one out of here. So this is a header, this connects to your, like the main line is also called a header line. So this is a drip header connector. So it connects to the header line in here with this little barb fitting. And this one happens to have a valve on it. So that way you can just open and close the valve. So that's a way to turn off the line right where it's at, which can be useful if you have a leak or anything like that. So they also make these that don't have a valve that just go straight to it. Either work fine. It's just this is nice to be able to turn off a line in case something happens to it. They're a little bit more expensive. These are about, like, depending on whether you get a valve or not, they might be like 30 to 75 cents a piece. But basically what you do is if you have, okay, sorry. So we've got our flat tube. It has this nice handy line that's very useful for determining where you want to put your holes. So you can just, you can say, all right, I've got my line going down my rows. Here's my bed right on this line here. I know that, all right, I need a drip line right there. So all you do is you take this little handy punch, stick it on the line, you just press it a little bit. And this is actually really easy to do. It's easier to do if the line has water in it. And bam, you see I made a little hole, right? So then I say, okay, here is, so you take the smaller side of the barb, and you just, again, this is a little easier if you actually have water in it. It helps keep the pressure open, but it's popped right in. And now it doesn't really want to come out. Then you just tighten up this little component. That helps keep the seal. And there we go. And then when you have your line, so drip tape typically comes in large rolls. You can, a lot of times they'll be hooked up to something on a tractor, but if you're just doing it by yourself, you can build a little contraption or have two people stand there with like a shovel and run the shovel through the hole in the roll. And I have a roll over here I can show you if you want. And then you just pull it out along the length of your bed, right next to your crop or where your crop is going to be, stick it down on the ground, and then cut it off at the end. And so when you cut it off, you attach it by gently pressing it. I guess one thing is here, so you see these two blue lines on this? That's telling you that's where your holes are going to be. If I'm going to pass some of these around, you see there's little slits on it. That's where the water comes out. So you want to make sure that that is actually facing up. And you gently press this on here. It's a little easier sometimes when there's a little bit more hose, but you want to make sure you get it good and tight on these barbs. And I'm going to pass these around. You're all going to get a chance to do this yourselves. And then you tighten this up. And then it doesn't come off. So that helps seal it, helps make sure that you are not having any issues with leaks. Again, I kind of twisted this around. And then the other important thing is, that line goes down, but you've just cut it off this big roll. You got to have something to stop the end. So they make these little end caps. So this just does the same sort of thing. Again, it's got this little barb. It just slides right in. You just press it in, make sure it's as far down as you can get it. Twist, 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 twist. And tight. And now nothing's going to get out the far end of your hose. If you don't want to spend the money on these, because again, these are like 20, 30 cents a piece, there are a couple other ways you can do it to close off the end. You can just take your hose or your tape at the end and just tie a knot in it. It can be kind of problematic to get it undone after that, but you can there's no reason you can't do it. Just that'll keep the water from getting out the end, usually. Sometimes you might have to double knot it. You can also, if I can undo this, you see it can be a little challenging to undo, especially if it's been sitting in the sun for a while. Another way you can do it is if you have a If you have an excess piece of drip line, which you will because you'll occasionally like break things off or whatever, you can take the end, fold it down, fold it in half, and then slip another piece of drip over it. And that'll keep it nice and tight. Yeah, that's the cheapo way to do it. Sometimes they leak. These are the sure way to get it nice and tight, but those are other ways you can seal it up. Other things that you have will be you might have ball valves throughout your system of various sizes. That allows you to isolate different sections. Obviously, so you can just open and close if you want to just only irrigate part of the field. If like one part of your field just gets wet more often, rather than like setting up different zones on a fancy system, you can just use valves. Totally doable, totally easy. So again, there's lots of greenhouse supplies or growing supplies. Again, we got all our supplies from Yoder's produce, but I think there's a lot of like vegetable like growing supply, like Johnny's also sells them. Which one? Yeah, great. Yes.
Menards has them too.
Okay.
It's not expensive as that, but it has the emitters already in them.
Oh, okay. Now the nice thing about this drip tape is it's very cheap. Most people will say, you use it 1 year and toss it. You can reuse it. I've used it for 3-4 years before. You just have to be careful, and you're going to kind of frequently get breaks in it, and when that happens, they sell splices. I don't have any on me right now, but basically you can then cut the sides and put the splice in and reconnect it to fix breaks in your drip line or leaks or anything like that. Or like if you're hoeing and you cut your drip line, you just put in a splice to fix it. So again, it's pretty affordable. And drip line is cheap, so you can just toss it at the end of the year, like I said. But if you want to reuse it, it is reusable. It's just kind of it can be a challenge to get it back on the line. One thing we had at Crown Point, which was nice, is a previous farm manager had built a little cart, and I'll get to your question in 1 second. Somebody had built a cart that then just had a couple posts, which we then threaded a piece of metal through that was attached to a handle. And so we put our tape on it, could just pull it out, cut it, or leave it as need be. And then at the end of the season, we would just put it back on the roll, tie it, and then crank it back in to reuse it. So yeah, it is, I guess it's, that can be problematic if you have a bunch of disease in your field. You can get it on there. So, again, fresh stuff is always the way to be your safest, but you can reuse it if you are frugal like me. Again, but I would say if you're running a piece of drip tape through a tomato field that ends up getting some really bad blight, I would probably just toss that, just so that you're not spreading it to wherever else you're going to do. Yes. So your question.
Is that the same thing as a soaker hose?
No, it is not. Soaker hoses are typically a lot more expensive because they're full, they're a full, much higher quality plastic, and they're big. I mean, you can use a soaker hose for the same function essentially. It's just you can get 7,500 feet of drip line for $80, and that's about how much 100 feet of soaker hose costs. So yeah, but you can do soaker hose. There's an in-between too. There are more sturdy irrigation lines that are just a little bit more heavy duty than drip tape. They're meant to last a few years. So that is sort of an in-between step if you wanted something that you can just leave in place a little bit more. But other than that, yeah, they're different things, but they do serve the similar purpose. This is just a lot cheaper. It's important to track how often you water. So in your records, in the record things that you have, there's water, there's irrigation logs. So just can be useful to know how much you're watering and to make sure that you're tracking your water usage so that you can know, like, hey, if I'm having a problem, oh, did I water? Oh, well, maybe I didn't. That's my problem. One thing is also important, wherever you have on your header line, any place that you have to, if you end it. So here I've got a little cap on here. You can see I've got a hose clamp. You're going to use a lot of hose clamps with irrigation because there's going to be times where you're going to want to like use elbows and tees and split things off into different sections. So always make sure you have a lot of hose clamps on hand. And sometimes you're going to need to double clamp things, triple clamp things. Well, you don't have to triple clamp usually, but clamping is going to be really important just to make sure that you don't have any leaks. We don't have any field demos. We're not going to do that. We're going to do spring crop planting next week, hopefully, assuming everything's in good shape. For those of you who would like to play around with the irrigation supplies and get a feel for how it feels to like punch holes in the tube, anything like that, and make attachments, if you want to just come up here and grab some stuff and play around with it, you can. One thing also important to note is as you lay your drip line out, I like to use these sod staples and hold the line in place because it can blow around a bit. And so something like these 6-inch sod staples are a nice easy way. They just go right over the hose or right over the line like this, pop it down, helps keep it in place.
And then you put your mulch on top.
Yes.
So you won't see that.
Yeah. I mean, you can have it on top. Like, if you're using an organic mulch, like leaves and stuff like that, you can have it on top. But like, it's mostly, like, especially if you're doing plastic or landscape fabric, it's better to have it underneath. If you're doing leaves or wood chips, you can have it on top. But it's fine either way. I mean, if it's underneath, then that water just stays under there. It doesn't evaporate as much, and you don't need to use as much water. And that'll be it for today. I guess if you could fill out those evaluations for the first 2 classes and this class and hand them in, that'd be great. You can just leave them on your chair. I would like, before you leave, everybody to just, I'm going to pass around a sheet that you can just sign in on, or actually, you know what, I'll have it in the back here. And then if you could just sign before you leave so I know that you were here. And again, hopefully next week we'll have we'll have something set up where you can just scan your phone on a QR code and that'll sign you in. Somebody's working on it higher up than me, so thank you all for coming.